The morning Ruth Brenner first crossed onto Noah Redmond's land, she had not been invited, had not been welcomed, and had absolutely no intention of staying longer than it took to retrieve her runaway goat. That was how it always started in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. Something small and inconvenient set everything else in motion, and by the time a person realized what had truly begun, they were already halfway through a life they had never planned. Ruth was 26 years old, with sun-darkened hands and dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned beneath her bonnet no matter how firmly she pressed the pins. She had come to Caldwell 2 years prior from Missouri after her father passed from a winter fever, leaving her a small house on the eastern edge of town, a modest sum of money that had already grown modester, and a stubbornness that the women at the church socials whispered was unbecoming for a widow-adjacent woman. Ruth had never been married, which was a fact that seemed to bother everyone in Caldwell considerably more than it bothered Ruth herself. She had her house. She had a small kitchen garden. She had 4 chickens, 1 mule named Douglas, and one extremely poor decision of a goat named Clarence, who had a talent for finding gaps in fencing that Ruth was certain were not there before. Clarence had escaped 3 mornings in a row. The first morning, Ruth found him at the edge of the road chewing a strip of bark off a post. The second morning, she found him in the widow Harkin's yard eating her petunias, which had required an extensive and diplomatic apology. The third morning, the morning that changed everything, she followed his muddy hoof prints due west, past the last of the familiar homesteads, along the creek bed, and through a stand of cottonwood trees until she arrived at the property line of a farm she had seen before only at a distance. Noah Redmond's place. She had heard his name in town, of course. Caldwell was not a large town, and Noah Redmond had been there long enough to have accumulated a reputation, though it was a quieter reputation than most. He had arrived from Texas 4 years prior, bought 40 acres of land that most people thought too dry to be worth anything, and proceeded to make it productive through some combination of hard work and stubbornness that the men at the general store alternately admired and resented. He was, by the account of those who actually knew him, a fair man, not given to argument, not given to much socializing either. He came to town for supplies. He nodded politely. He went home. Ruth had seen him twice. The first time he was loading grain sacks into a wagon in front of Haber's Supply, and the second time he was crossing the main street on horseback, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. Both times she had registered him in the casual way one registers any neighbor. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the way that Kansas sun weathered everything eventually, with dark hair that had started to silver just slightly at the temples, even though she suspected he could not be more than 32 or 33. Both times she had thought nothing of it beyond the ordinary courtesy of being aware of one's neighbors. That third morning, with Clarence's trail leading directly through a break in the split-rail fence at the back of Noah Redmond's property, Ruth did not hesitate. She stepped through the gap in the fence, pulled her skirts clear of the lower rail, and went in after her goat. She found Clarence almost immediately, because Clarence had found Noah Redmond's kitchen garden, and the kitchen garden was an extraordinary thing. It was laid out along the south-facing slope beside the farmhouse, catching the morning sun beautifully, and it was clearly the work of someone who understood what they were doing. There were rows of beans already climbing their poles, early tomatoes staked and tied with strips of cloth, onions in a careful line, squash spreading their broad leaves, herbs along the border rosemary, sage, thyme. The soil had been turned and worked until it was deep and dark. Everything was watered and weeded and healthy. Clarence was standing in the middle of it eating the bean plants. "Clarence," Ruth said, in the voice she used when she wanted to communicate that she was profoundly displeased but still intended to remain civil. Clarence ignored her. He tore another length of bean vine free with remarkable enthusiasm. She waded in after him, grabbing for his rope halter, and got him by the ear first, which caused him to bleat in offense and back into the tomato stakes. Ruth caught the nearest stake before it toppled, righted it, then finally got her hand on the halter and pulled Clarence back with the firm authority of someone who had been managing difficult situations their whole life. She surveyed the damage. It was not catastrophic. The beans had taken the worst of it, but only a short section. The rest was intact. She felt the particular guilt of someone who knows they are responsible for someone else's property being harmed, and she knelt right there in the garden to press the disturbed soil back around the roots and retie the nearest plant as well as she could manage. She was still crouched in the garden, Clarence's rope looped around her wrist, when she heard the farmhouse door open. She stood quickly, brushing dirt from her hands, and faced the man walking toward her across the yard. Noah Redmond in person was different from Noah Redmond at a distance. Up close, he had a directness about him that was not unfriendly exactly, but was certainly not soft. His eyes were dark brown, the kind of brown that held its color even in full sun, and he looked at her and then at Clarence, and then at his garden with an expression that moved through several emotions quickly enough that she could not track all of them. "Good morning," Ruth said, because it seemed important to establish immediately that she was not a threat and was not unaware of social conventions. "I am Ruth Brenner. My goat got through your fence. I am sorry about your beans. I have tried to fix what I can." Noah Redmond looked at the garden for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Then, unexpectedly, something in his expression eased, and he said, "He does look pleased with himself." Clarence was, in fact, still chewing. "He is the most inconsiderate animal I own," Ruth said honestly. "I am genuinely sorry about your garden." Noah crouched down to look at the section where the beans had been eaten, running a hand along the remaining vine. He pressed the soil around the base the way she had done, checked the stake. After a moment he stood. "It'll come back," he said. "The damage isn't bad." He glanced at her sideways. "You know gardens." "I have one of my own," she said. "Eastern side of town, the Brenner place." "Across from the creek," he said, not a question. He had apparently registered her the same way she had registered him, from a distance, in passing, the way you know your neighbors without knowing them. "I will fix your fence," she said. "The break that he came through, I'll bring materials." He shook his head. "I'll see to it. It's my responsibility. He's my goat." "Ma'am, Ruth," she said, because ma'am felt too formal for someone whose bean plants she had allowed Clarence to eat. He paused. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile but not quite committed to it yet. "Ruth," he said, "I'll see to the fence." She opened her mouth to argue further, then thought better of it. She had learned in 26 years that some arguments were worth having and some were not. She gathered Clarence's rope more firmly and nodded. "Thank you," she said. "And again, I am sorry." She walked back toward the fence gap, Clarence trotting beside her with an air of complete satisfaction, and she did not look back. She told herself she was not thinking about the garden, the careful, orderly rows, the dark-worked soil, the way Noah Redmond had crouched to check the plants with the same care she would have used. She told herself that for about 3 days, until she noticed his fence had indeed been repaired, and she felt a small warm thing move through her chest that she immediately told herself was just neighborly satisfaction. The weeks that followed were unremarkable on the surface, but full of the small accumulations that tend, in retrospect, to look like inevitability. She saw him at Haber's Supply twice more. He tipped his hat. She nodded. Once their hands nearly reached for the same sack of flour at the same moment, and they both stopped and laughed a little, just a brief uncalculated thing, and then he stepped back and let her take it, which she appreciated but also thought was somewhat unnecessary since there were other sacks. May became warmer. Ruth expanded her kitchen garden. She spent her evenings on her porch in the long Kansas dusk, watching the western horizon go from gold to rose to the deep bluish purple that always came just before dark, and she thought about practical things. The loose board on the porch step. Whether she had enough preserved beans to last through another winter if the garden did not produce well. Whether Douglas, the mule, was developing a limp or merely having a lazy week. She did not think about Noah Redmond's garden, except occasionally when she did. Then, In the second week of June, she heard from Mrs. Calloway at the post office that Noah Redmond was ill. "Came through town yesterday looking very poorly," Mrs. Calloway said, sorting letters with the focused efficiency of a woman who viewed information as part of her official duties. "Thomas Haber said he came in for supplies and could barely stand straight. Said he had the fever that's been going around. It's been bad, you know. Took the 'prentice boy, God rest him." Ruth said, "That's unfortunate," and took her mail and went home. The fever that had been moving through Caldwell that June was a bad one, not cholera, not typhoid, but a virulent thing that had started among the cattle drovers coming up from Indian Territory and had spread into the town population. It swept through the body hard and fast. Most people recovered in a week or two. Some did not. Noah Redmond lived alone. He had no wife, no family nearby that anyone knew of. His nearest neighbor to the west was 4 miles out. Ruth was perhaps a mile east along the creek. She told herself it was none of her business. She woke at 3 in the morning 2 days after Mrs. Calloway's report and lay in her dark room, listening to the night sounds of the Kansas plains, the wind, the distant cry of something wild, the soft shifting of Douglas in his stall, and thought about Noah Redmond alone in his farmhouse with a fever bad enough that Thomas Haber had noticed it, and no one to check on him, and his garden sitting in the June sun with no one to water it. At 5 in the morning she got up. She told herself she would simply look in on him. It was neighborly. The town had an obligation to its members. She would bring some of the broth she had made yesterday. She had made extra because she always made extra, not because she had been thinking about this. And she would see that he was managing, and she would come home. She had the broth in a covered pot. She had a cloth soaked in cool water, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the moisture in. She walked the mile along the creek road in the early blue of the summer morning, with the meadowlarks just starting their singing and the dew still heavy on the grass. She knocked on his door twice and got no answer. She opened it because she was not going to walk a mile and turn around, and she found Noah Redmond on his bed in the back room, asleep but poorly flushed with fever, his breathing too fast and shallow, the bedclothes tangled as if he had been fighting them all night. He woke when she came through the doorway and looked at her with the unfocused eyes of a man whose fever is running high enough that certainty about what is real has become provisional. "Ruth Brenner," he said, and his voice was rough and surprised. "Don't get up," she said firmly. "I have brought broth. You need to drink it." "You didn't have to. I know I didn't," she said. "Drink." He drank. She changed the cloth on his forehead. She checked that he had water. She assessed the state of his house with the quick practical eye of a woman who had nursed her father through 2 winters of illness and had no sentimentality about it. It needed cleaning. He had not been eating. His water barrel was nearly empty. She went outside and drew water from the well. She came back and did the necessary things, not fussing, not making much of it, just doing what needed doing. When she was satisfied that he was as comfortable as she could make him and was drinking the broth, she went out to the garden. It had been 3 days without watering. In June Kansas heat, 3 days was enough to stress the plants considerably. She drew more water and watered everything thoroughly, methodically, the way she watered her own garden, starting at the roots, not the leaves, slow and even. She weeded while she was there because the weeds did not care that a man was ill. She retied a tomato plant that had come loose from its stake. Then she went home because she had her own work and her own animals. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 3rd morning, Noah was more lucid. The fever had broken somewhat in the night, and he was sitting up in bed when she arrived, looking pale and thin and more like himself than he had. He heard her knock and called for her to come in, and when she appeared in the doorway of his room, he looked at her with a complicated expression she could not quite read. "You came yesterday," he said. It was a statement, but it had a question inside it. "And the day before," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he said. Then more carefully, "You've been tending my garden." "The beans are coming back in nicely," she said. "No thanks to Clarence." He almost smiled. The attempt was visible and genuine even through the pallor of the fever. "You didn't have to do that." "Someone had to," she said. She brought in the fresh broth she had carried from her house and set it on the table by his bed, and she did not look at him while she fussed with the cloth and the water, because the expression on his face was one she did not quite know how to meet. It was the expression of a man who has discovered something that has caught him entirely off guard. "I don't have many visitors," he said. "I can see that," she said, glancing at the house with its evident bachelor's spareness. Everything practical and nothing personal except the books on the shelf by the window. She had noticed those on her first day, a good number of them, which had surprised her not because it was unusual but because she had not expected to feel pleased by the sight of them. "Why did you come?" he asked, not accusingly, just honestly wanting to know. She considered the question. She could give him the neighborly answer, which was true as far as it went. Or she could give him the 3 in the morning answer, which was more complicated and which she had not fully worked out herself. "You live alone," she said finally. "The fever is bad this season. It seemed like someone should check." She paused. "And I know what it is to be ill without anyone to draw the water." Something in his expression softened. It was not pity he was looking at her with, it was recognition. "Your father," he said. She looked at him. "You know about that?" "Not much," he said. "Only that you came from Missouri. People talk, but not in much detail where you're concerned. I think you're fairly private." "I am," she agreed. "As are you, from what I can tell." "I am," he said, almost echoing her, and there was something quietly companionable about the two of them acknowledging that to each other. She stayed another hour, ensuring he ate something and that the house was in reasonable order. When she left, she told him she would be back tomorrow, and he said that wasn't necessary, and she said she was aware of that, and she left. She returned the next morning, and the morning after that. In the days that followed, a pattern established itself without either of them quite deciding on it. Ruth would arrive in the early morning before the heat of the day. She would check on Noah. His fever improved steadily, though the illness was stubborn and the full weakness of it clung to him for over 2 weeks, and tend to whatever he needed. She drew water, prepared simple food, swept the house. And she tended the garden. The garden became, she realized, the thing she looked forward to most. Not because the garden was more interesting than Noah. It was not, but because it was where she could think clearly, hands in the soil, making order. And because when she was in the garden she could feel that she was doing something real and useful, contributing something tangible to this man's life in a way that felt honest and uncomplicated. He began, as his strength returned, to watch her from the farmhouse porch. She would be kneeling in the garden, or moving along the rows with the watering can, and she would feel his eyes on her and look up to find him sitting in the chair on the porch. A large wooden chair with arm rests he had clearly made himself, solid and practical, watching her with a quietness that was attentive rather than idle. He never called out to her. He just watched, and she grew accustomed to the weight of his attention, which was not uncomfortable but was more present than she had expected. One morning, near the end of his 2nd week of illness, she was in the garden in the early light, pulling weeds from between the onion rows, when she heard his chair creak and then his footsteps on the porch steps. She looked up. He had come off the porch and was crossing the yard toward her, moving carefully. He was still not entirely steady on his feet, she could see, but with the deliberate intention of a man who has decided something. "You should be resting," she said. "I've been resting for 2 weeks," he said. "I'm going mad." He lowered himself carefully to crouch beside her, not in the garden, he was too careful for that, but at its edge. He looked at what she had done. The garden was, she had to admit, in excellent shape. She had worked it every morning, sometimes in the afternoon too when she came back to check on him, and the plants were thriving in the June heat with the consistent watering and weeding. "You know this garden better than I do at this point," he said. "I've been learning it," she said. That was true. She had come to know which plants were his stronger producers and which were struggling with the soil on the northern end, which herbs preferred the dryness and which wanted more moisture, where the light fell best at what time of day. He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands move through the soil. Then he said, "How long have you been coming?" 12 days, she said. He absorbed that. 12 days was not an incidental thing. 12 days of waking before dawn, walking a mile along the creek road, spending 2 or 3 hours tending someone else's property and then walking home to tend her own. He would know that as well as she did. "Ruth," he said and stopped. She looked at him. The morning light came over the flat horizon and lit his face warmly, filling in the hollows left by the illness. He was thinner than he had been, and there was still a paleness under his weathered skin, but his eyes were clear and direct and looking at her with something she had been trying not to name. "Thank you," he said. "I don't have the words for it, but thank you." "You don't need words," she said. "The garden needed tending." "That's not what I mean," he said. "I mean all of it, coming every morning, the broth, the water." He paused, talking to me when I was well enough to talk and not filling the silence when I wasn't. She did not know what to do with the earnestness of it. She was not accustomed to earnestness directed at her. She tucked it away carefully and looked back at the soil. "Anyone would have done the same," she said. "No," he said, quietly but absolutely certain. "They wouldn't, not everyone." She stayed that morning longer than usual. Noah sat on the porch and she sat on the top step, and they talked with the ease of two people who had spent enough time in each other's presence, in silence, that conversation had become the natural next step. He told her about coming from Texas, about ranching down there for a decade before deciding that what he wanted was something of his own, something he could build and know every inch of. She told him about Missouri, about her father, about the garden she had kept for him through his last winter, because it had been the only thing she knew to do that felt like fighting back against helplessness. "You put your whole self into a garden when you love someone," she said, and then heard what she had said and felt the air on the porch shift. She did not look at him. She looked at the garden. "I suppose you do," Noah said carefully, and she could hear the care in it. He was well enough by the end of the third week to work again, tentatively at first, half days, nothing too strenuous. He insisted on coming out to the garden himself, though it was clear the bending and crouching cost him effort. She watched him from the corner of her eye the first time, and did not say anything about how his face went tight when he straightened up. He would not want that noticed, and said aloud. She had stopped feeling like a visitor at this point. She was not sure when that had happened exactly. Somewhere between the 5th and 10th morning of coming through the fence gap by the creek, of knowing where he kept the watering can, and which bucket was for the garden and which for the animals, of sitting on his porch in the early morning light with a cup of coffee she made from his supplies, because he always had it ready on the stove now as if he expected her. Somewhere in all of that, she had stopped being a neighbor doing a neighborly thing, and become something she did not have a word for yet. One morning in early July, he was largely recovered by now, though not yet at full strength. She came through the gate to find him already in the garden. He was kneeling beside the tomato plants, examining the fruits, and he turned when he heard her footsteps. "You don't have to keep coming," he said, not dismissively, almost apologetically, as if he thought he had imposed on her long enough. She stopped at the edge of the garden. "I know," she said. "I'm well enough now," he said. "I can see that," she said. There was a pause. The morning was already warm, the blue sky deep and vast above the Kansas plain the way it got in July, the meadowlarks going at full voice in the long grass beyond the fence. "But you came anyway," he said. "I wanted to see how the beans were doing," she said, which was true and also not the full truth, and she thought they both knew that. He stood slowly, dusting his hands on his trousers. He looked at her across the garden with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. Not his public face, not even the private face she had come to know during his illness, but something underneath all of that, something less certain and therefore more honest. "Ruth," he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I've been watching you tend this garden for weeks," he said, "and I know what it means when a person gives their time and care to something. You've been treating this garden and this place like it matters to you, and I've been trying to figure out how to ask whether it does." She was quiet for a moment. The meadowlark sang on. "It does," she said finally. "Is it the garden?" he asked. His voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not even at all. She took a breath. "No," she said, "it isn't only the garden." He crossed the distance between them in the way that felt both sudden and like it had been building for weeks, stopping just in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her chin up to look at his face. His eyes were searching hers with an intensity that was very much his and no one else's. "I am not good at this," he said, "at saying things like this. I should tell you that plainly so you understand it when I stumble over it." "I know," she said. "I'm not particularly good at it either." "But I want to try," he said. She felt the warm, serious weight of that. "Then try," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the one still holding the small trowel she had brought, and very deliberately moved the trowel to her other hand and kept hold of the one it had vacated. His hand was rough, calloused, and warm, and it held hers with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, and she felt her heart make a movement that was clearly not neighborly and had not been for quite some time. "I think I would like you to keep coming," he said. "Not for the garden, for this. Whatever this is. I think I would like that too," she said. What came after that was not a sweeping declaration. Neither of them was built for sweeping declarations. What came after was simpler and, she thought, truer. He didn't let go of her hand, and they walked to the porch together, and she made the coffee and he sat in his chair and she sat on the step, the way they had been doing for weeks, except now the thing between them had a shape they had both acknowledged. July unfurled itself across the Kansas plain with all the extravagance of a summer that has decided it means business. The heat was enormous and relentless, the sky an astonishing blue from horizon to horizon, the land shimmering at the edges of vision in the afternoon. Ruth's kitchen garden at the Brenner place was producing well more than she could eat herself, which was a familiar problem she solved the same way she always had, by pressing food on people who could use it. She was at Haber's Supply in the second week of July when she overheard the conversation that reminded her, abruptly, that the world had edges she had not been attending to. Two men she recognized vaguely from the ranching operations south of town were talking in the back corner of the store, and they were talking about the Comanche trails and the Army presence and the land surveys being extended, and one of them said something about how much of the unregistered land east of the creek would be up for formal claim, and the other said that there was talk of reclassifying some of the older registered lots because the original survey had errors. She did not stay to hear more because it was not her business, but the word lot settled in her chest uneasily. The Brenner property had been deeded to her father through a land grant issued in 1875, and while she had the papers, she also knew that the land office in Caldwell had been a disorganized institution in the years before the current land agent, Marcus Fell, had taken it over, and Fell had a reputation as a man who found errors in older grants with a frequency that certain people in town found suspicious. She mentioned it to Noah that evening. She had taken to having supper with him 3 or 4 times a week, a fact that had not gone unremarked by the town, and which both of them had decided to be straightforward about by being openly straightforward about it, which was their approach to most things. "I know Fell," Noah said. He said it with a flatness that communicated a very specific kind of familiarity. "He tried to find issues with my deed the year after I bought the place." "What happened?" "My deed was solid," Noah said, "and I had a lawyer out of Wichita look it over before I signed. But Fell doesn't pursue men who are ready for him. He goes after easier prospects." Ruth looked down at her plate. She was not going to pretend she was an easy prospect in any personal sense of the word, but her deed situation might be another matter. She did not have a Wichita lawyer. She had her father's papers, which she had read carefully and which she believed were correct, but belief and a documented legal certainty were different things. "Let me look at your papers," Noah said. "Not a command, an offer." "You're not a lawyer," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what a proper deed looks like, and I know what Fell tends to look for. Let me look." She brought the papers the next morning. He sat at his kitchen table with the lamp and the documents spread out in front of him, and he went through them carefully and slowly in the way he did everything, and after 20 minutes he looked up. "The survey date is wrong," he said. "Not in a way that invalidates the grant, but in a way that Fell could choose to use if he wanted to claim there was a discrepancy. The original plat map shows your eastern boundary at the creek bed, but the description in the deed text says the property line is 12 feet east of the main water channel as measured in season, and that phrasing is ambiguous enough that it could be argued either way. "That is not encouraging," Ruth said. "No," he agreed. "You should get that looked at properly, before Fell looks at it first." She wrote that week to a land attorney in Wichita whose name Noah provided. The response came back 3 weeks later with an assessment that confirmed Noah's reading and recommended filing a clarifying survey, a formal, legal reaffirmation of the boundary, which would cost money she did not have easily to spare but would permanently close the ambiguity. Noah offered to lend her the money. She refused initially, and then thought about it for 2 days, and then accepted, on the strict condition that it was a loan with repayment terms they wrote down on actual paper, and which she signed. He tried to tell her the formality was unnecessary, and she told him that it was not about trust, it was about dignity, and he looked at her for a moment with something that was clearly admiration even if he did not say so, and said, "All right, let's write it down." Marcus Fell did, in fact, come calling at the Brenner property the week after Ruth filed the clarifying survey. He came on a Wednesday afternoon in August, a compact and fastidiously dressed man with a pleasant smile that had very little warmth behind it, and he stood on her porch with his hat in his hand and told her that he had been reviewing the older grants in the area and had noticed some potential issues with hers. "I've filed a clarifying survey," Ruth said pleasantly. "The documentation is currently with the land attorney in Wichita. I understand it will be formally recorded within the month." The pleasantness in Fell's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes adjusted. "I see," he said. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He replaced his hat. "No," he said, "just a routine review." He went away, and Ruth stood on her porch and let out a breath that carried 3 weeks of quiet tension with it. Then she laughed, just briefly, just a short release of it into the August afternoon, and went inside to write a letter to Noah to tell him what had happened. She had written him twice already that summer, for practical reasons, and both times she had found the letters longer than she had expected, because once she started writing to Noah Redmond, there were things she had apparently been storing up to say. He had written back both times in a direct and economical hand that nonetheless managed to cover several pages, which she found more satisfying than she could readily explain. When he came for supper that Friday, she told him the story of Fell's visit, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and when she finished he said, "Good," with a satisfaction that was entirely on her behalf, and she felt that warmth again, the one she had stopped trying to talk herself out of. August was full and golden and alive. Ruth's garden peaked in its midsummer abundance, and she brought Noah tomatoes so ripe and heavy they had to be eaten that day, and green beans, and the first of the sweet corn. He brought her eggs from his hens, which were apparently better layers than hers, and a jar of honey from a wild hive he had found at the back of his property. Small exchanges, small offerings, the language of people who are finding each other through the particular vocabulary of the land they work. He walked her home along the creek road most evenings she came to supper. This was a recent development. It had started 3 weeks ago when a thunderstorm had blown in faster than expected, and he had walked her home through the warm summer rain without her asking, and without making a production of it. She had suggested afterward that she was perfectly capable of walking home alone in the dark, and he had agreed readily, and then walked her home the next evening anyway, and she had decided not to repeat the argument. The walks were something she had come to value in a way she had not anticipated. They were different from sitting on the porch or talking at the table. There was something about the movement, the dark road, the creek sound beside them, that made conversation come differently. Things she might not have said in a chair face to face, she found herself saying on the creek road in the summer dark. One evening in late August she said, "I was engaged once, and she was not sure why she said it at that moment, except that they had been talking about family and time passing in the loose, connected way those conversations built themselves, and it was something that had been in the background of her life long enough that it felt relevant to say aloud. Noah walked for a moment without speaking. Then, "What happened?" "He died," she said. "Before we were married. It was 5 years ago. He was a young man I had known since childhood, and he died of a disease that moved through the county very quickly, and I spent 6 months after it in a particular kind of gray that I don't have a better word for. And then my father got ill, and I spent 2 years tending him, and then he died, and I came west." She paused. "I don't tell people about this usually." "You can tell me," he said, simple and unadorned. "I know," she said. "That's why I did." He reached over in the dark and found her hand and held it the way he had done in the garden that July morning, with that same deliberate warmth, and they walked the rest of the way to her gate without talking, and it was enough. She had asked him, not long after, about his own life before Kansas. He told her that he had left Texas partly for the land, and partly for the particular loneliness of having spent a decade building something for a future that kept failing to arrive the way he had imagined it. He had been involved with a woman in Texas, he said, a rancher's daughter, and it had not ended in any dramatic way, just in the slow way that things that are not quite right tend to end when both people are honest enough to acknowledge it. She wanted the ranch her father had, he said. Not a new thing in an unproven place. She was right to want what she wanted. It just was not what I wanted. "And Kansas was what you wanted?" Ruth asked. He looked out over his land in the particular way he had that long, slow assessment, as if he was checking it was still there and still his, which she had come to understand was not anxiety but something more like gratitude. "Kansas and this farm, yes," he said. "And now other things too." He glanced at her sideways when he said that last part, and she looked back with deliberate composure that she did not quite feel. September came with the first hints of the coming fall mornings that had a clean edge to them, the light changing its angle, the cottonwoods beginning to go gold at the tips. The harvest work intensified, which meant they saw less of each other during the days because there was simply too much to do, but the evenings remained theirs. It was on a September Sunday after church Ruth attended the Methodist services in town regularly, more for the community than from deep doctrinal conviction, that Reverend Aldridge intercepted her on the church steps with a conversation that managed to be simultaneously well-intentioned and intrusive in the specific way that church conversations often were. "I understand you have been spending a great deal of time at the Redmond farm," Reverend Aldridge said, with the expression of a man who is going to have a pastoral concern whether it is welcome or not. "I have been neighborly," Ruth said calmly. "Mr. Redmond was ill and needed assistance. He appears to have recovered some weeks ago," the Reverend noted. "Yes," Ruth said, "he has." Reverend Aldridge opened his mouth. "If you are going to tell me that my reputation requires consideration," Ruth said, keeping her voice pleasant, "I would simply say that I am 26 years old, I own my own property, I conduct myself with complete propriety, and I appreciate your concern." She smiled at him. "Good morning, Reverend." She walked to where Douglas was tied and drove herself home and felt, for about half a mile, genuinely annoyed and then felt something else, something almost amused. The Reverend was not a bad man. He was a conventional one, and convention had its own logic. She told Noah about it that evening. He listened with his characteristic stillness, and then he said something she had not quite expected. "He's not wrong that your reputation is a concern," Noah said, "in the sense that people's opinions in a small town have practical weight. I don't think you've done anything wrong, but I also think he stopped." "What?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I think that if we're honest about what this is, then the question of what to do about it has an obvious answer." Her heart did something interesting. "Is that are you?" She stopped and then almost laughed at herself for being suddenly inarticulate. She was not usually inarticulate. "I am not good at sweeping gestures," he said. "I told you that at the beginning, so I will just say it plainly. I want to marry you, Ruth. I have wanted it for some time now." I should have said it more formally and with more preparation, and probably not on a September Sunday evening on my porch without any of this being properly arranged. But I am saying it." She looked at him. The evening light was going its rose and gold way behind him, and the garden was rich and full behind the fence, and this man who was honest and careful and steady was looking at her with an earnestness that made her chest ache with the specific sweetness of something you have been hoping for without letting yourself fully admit the hope. "I want that too," she said. He let out a breath. She had not realized he had been holding one. "Then that's settled," he said, and the simplicity of it made her laugh. A full, bright sound, and then he laughed too, and it was the best sound she had heard from him, unreserved and completely real. They were married in October in the Methodist church, on a Saturday morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to full gold, and the air smelled of autumn and harvested grain. Ruth wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had pressed the night before and accented with a white collar. Noah wore his good suit and had made, she noticed with a warmth that nearly undid her composure, a clear effort with his hair. The ceremony was attended by most of Caldwell, because in a town that size nearly everyone comes to a wedding, and because there were enough people who had watched Noah and Ruth's situation develop over the summer with the particular interest that small communities bring to these things that there was genuine investment in the outcome. Mrs. Calloway from the post office cried. Thomas Haber from the supply store shook Noah's hand so firmly afterward that Noah flexed his fingers several times in apparent concern. Reverend Aldridge performed the ceremony with warmth, and no reference to his September conversation with Ruth, for which she was genuinely grateful. They exchanged their vows in the plain and honest way that suited them both, without theatrical elaboration, and when it was done and Noah looked at her with that look, the one she had come to know, the one he only had for her, she thought that it was not a thing that required any additional words. The reception was at the Habers' barn, which was large enough for dancing, and there was indeed dancing, and Ruth danced with Noah, who was, somewhat to her delight and somewhat to his evident self-consciousness, not a graceful dancer but a fully committed one, which she decided counted for more. She danced with Thomas Haber and with the Reverend and with old Mr. Prentice, whose son had died in the spring fever, and who held her hands very gently and said she had a good heart, and that the town was lucky she had come west. Late in the evening, after the music had wound down and people were beginning the long process of farewell that country gatherings required, Noah found her at the edge of the barn where she had stepped out for a breath of cold October air, and he came to stand beside her, and they looked at the dark Kansas sky together, which was extravagant with stars as it always was so far from any city. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the stars were brilliant, and the night was cold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were letting their gold leaves go in the wind, and none of it needed any commentary. They had talked, in the weeks between his proposal and the wedding, about what the practical arrangements would be. Ruth's house could be rented. There was no shortage of people coming into Caldwell looking for property, and she would move to Noah's farm. She had felt privately a complicated thing about leaving the Brenner house, which was her father's and hers. Noah had understood without her having to explain the full weight of it, which was one of the several reasons she was marrying him. "We can keep it," he had said. "Rent it and know it's there." "That's not practical," she had said. "We don't have to be purely practical about everything," he had said. She had looked at him, this quietly practical man, giving her permission to be impractical about her father's house, and had felt something rearrange inside her. They rented it to a young couple named Whitfield who had come up from Oklahoma Territory, newly arrived and needing a place, and Ruth had walked through the rooms one last time on the morning. She moved out and stood in the kitchen where her father had sat, and told the room something private and silent before she closed the door. The farm became hers by degrees over the fall and winter, the way a place does when you work it and know it. When you have your own stake in the soil, your own understanding of where the drainage runs poorly and where the afternoon light pools warmest. She brought her kitchen garden knowledge to the farm's garden, and over the winter months she and Noah sat by the stove in the evenings making plans for the spring planting that were longer and more ambitious than either had previously attempted alone, because two people with two gardens worth of knowledge and two sets of hands make for considerably greater possibility than one. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was a hard one, a fact of Kansas winters, which were not subtle in their intentions. The cold came in December and laid down like something that intended to stay, and there were weeks where the work of simply keeping the animals alive and the pipes from freezing and the wood supply adequate occupied most of their days. But the farmhouse was solid. Noah had built it for the climate, and the evenings were warm and quiet, and Ruth learned that the man who was outwardly so contained had a dry and very particular sense of humor that came out most fully in the evenings when it was just the two of them, when the day's work was done and the fire was good, and there was no performance required. She had not expected to find, at 26, after years of management and self-sufficiency, and the particular independence that grief enforces, something that felt so genuinely easy. Not easy in the sense that nothing required effort, everything required effort. Farming in Kansas in the 1880s required nearly constant effort, but easy in the sense of fitting. Like two pieces of the same oak, different grain but compatible, holding their joint without complaint. She found out she was expecting their first child in February of 1883. She told Noah on a cold Tuesday morning matter-of-factly before he went out to check the cattle, because she did not see the point in creating ceremony around information when the information was enough on its own. He stood very still for a moment in the kitchen doorway. Then he turned around, came back to the table, sat down across from her, and looked at her with an expression so fully open that she felt it in her ribs. Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "I'm healthy as the horses. I'm just also pregnant." He covered her hands with both of his on the tabletop and held them there for a long moment without speaking. She let him have the silence. When he finally said something, it was, "I am very glad." "So am I," she said. Their son was born in September of 1883, on a day that was warm and golden in the way that September was in Kansas, and they named him James after Ruth's father, which had been Noah's suggestion, delivered with a quietness that had entirely disarmed her when he made it. James Redmond arrived in the world with considerable enthusiasm and a very specific opinion about being kept waiting, making his presence comprehensively known from his first moment. And Noah, who held him very carefully in the big rough hands that knew how to hold things without breaking them, looked at this new small person with an expression that Ruth would remember the rest of her life. She had said once, months ago, that you put your whole self into a garden when you love someone. Watching Noah with James, she understood that what she had said was true but also insufficient. That love was not just the act of tending. It was the choice to remain, the daily return, the willingness to be there even in the cold and the difficulty, especially then. James grew in the way that healthy babies do, demanding and rewarding in equal measure. He was, by 8 months, a determined crawler with a particular interest in everything he was not supposed to have, and by his first autumn he was pulling himself to standing on the furniture with the same focused stubbornness that Ruth recognized as familiar from two different directions. The farm grew too. In 1884, they added a second cattle pen, expanded the kitchen garden substantially, and planted a larger field of winter wheat that would, if the season cooperated, produce well enough to sell a meaningful surplus. Noah had been working toward this systematically since before Ruth arrived, but her presence had reorganized his timeline, because two people managing a farm together freed each of them from the limitations of single-handed operation. Ruth took over the household accounts entirely, which Noah yielded with undisguised relief. Numbers were not his territory in the same way that they were hers, and she had a facility for record-keeping and calculation that she had inherited from her father, who had been meticulous about such things. She could see, across the ledgers of the past years, the shape of what the farm had been building toward and the shape of what it could become, and that shape was a good one. In the summer of 1884, there was a drought scare. July went dry enough that Ruth spent 3 weeks watering the kitchen garden by hand twice a day, drawing from the well until the well looked lower than she liked, watching the sky for weather that was reluctant to come. Noah's wheat field was on dry land, not irrigated, and there were 2 weeks in July where they both woke early every morning and looked at the sky and tried not to say the things they were thinking about what a failed crop would mean. The rain came in the last week of July, enough rain and then steady moderate precipitation through August, and the wheat recovered adequately. Not a banner year, but not a disaster. Ruth, who had been keeping her worry very quiet for those 3 weeks, sat on the porch on the evening the rain broke and felt the released tension move through her like something physical. Noah sat beside her and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Next year I want to put in irrigation along the west rows at least." "I was thinking the same thing," she said, "and a cistern. We could do a cistern in the spring if the wheat money holds." "It should hold," she said. "The numbers are—" She stopped. He was looking at her with a slight smile. "I trust the numbers," he said, "since you are the one who keeps them." She appreciated that. Not just the trust, but the plain way he said it, without any of the awkwardness some men had about a woman managing financial records. It was simply factual to Noah. She was better at this, therefore she should do it. That approach to the practical division of their work had been one of the unspoken understandings that made everything function. James, at 1 year old and then growing rapidly toward 2, was becoming his own person in the very specific and entertaining way that toddlers did, full of opinions, limited in patience, deeply interested in the garden and the animals with an enthusiasm that occasionally required intervention. He had Noah's dark eyes and Ruth's tendency to consider a situation carefully before committing to an action, which in a 2-year-old looked less like thoughtfulness and more like the strategic assessment of which response would get him the furthest. Ruth and Noah found him one morning in the spring of 1885. He was 19 months old in the kitchen garden, carefully and methodically picking every green tomato off the nearest plant. He had apparently been at work for some time. He looked up at them with an expression that weighed his options and then smiled with great confidence, as if this had been entirely the plan. Noah crouched down to James's level, and Ruth watched from the garden gate, and the conversation that followed, conducted largely in Noah's careful explanation and James's enthusiastic but non-verbal counterargument, was one of the finer things she had witnessed in her life. "He is absolutely your son," Noah said afterward, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "He absolutely is," Ruth agreed. "But I notice the strategic smile is yours." Noah looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it did. "Is it?" "Entirely," she said. "They replanted what could be replanted." James was steered firmly toward the section of the garden where Ruth had begun giving him his own small plot of ground and his own small trowel, which proved to be the correct strategy. He was entirely satisfied with the authority of his own patch and left the rest of the garden in considerably better peace thereafter. The Caldwell of 1885 was a different town than the Caldwell Ruth had arrived in 3 years prior. The cattle trade had been the lifeblood of the town through the late 1870s and into the early 1880s, with the Kishom Trail driving an enormous commerce through thousands of head of cattle moving north to the railhead, drovers filling the saloons, money coming and going with the season. But the quarantine laws that Kansas kept pushing south, combined with the expansion of ranching in the northern territories, had begun shifting the patterns. The long drive was contracting. Some of the saloons had closed or changed their character. There were more farmers and fewer drovers, more permanent residents and fewer transient ones. Ruth and Noah discussed this at length, as it affected everything from the local economy to property values to what goods Haber's supply stocked. Noah was of the opinion that the shift toward farming rather than open-range ranching was, in the long term, the more stable foundation, that the era of the great cattle drives was ending, and what would replace it was settlement, communities, the slow, deep work of making the land produce consistently. Ruth agreed and thought the shift was coming faster than most people in town were acknowledging. Marcus Fell, the land agent, had indeed found someone easier to target than Ruth after the clarifying survey resolved her situation, and the person he found was a homesteader named Chester Abel, a man with a large family and a shaky land claim from the 1877 wave of settlement who had not had the foresight or the resources to get proper legal documentation. The situation with Abel became something of a cause in town. There was a meeting at the church hall where the matter was debated at length, and several of the more established landholders, Noah among them, spoke on Abel's behalf and helped raise money for a land attorney. It was not resolved perfectly. The legal system in Kansas Territory was not always a fair instrument, but the collective pressure and the attorney's efforts resulted in Abel keeping most of his land with only a small disputed boundary strip lost. Fell appeared afterward to moderate his activities somewhat, possibly because the town had demonstrated a willingness to combine resources against him. Ruth wrote the meeting's proceedings up for the Caldwell newspaper at the editor's request. She had submitted 2 pieces to the paper before, on practical farming matters, and the editor had been pleased with her clear and direct writing, and her account was published with her name on it, which was still a somewhat unusual thing for a woman's byline in 1885, a fact she was aware of and not particularly impressed by, in the sense that she thought the rarity ought to be less rare. Noah read her piece in the paper and set it down carefully and looked at her with a pride that was so plainly felt she almost looked away from it. "That's well done," he said. "That is exactly what happened, and you've written it so a person who wasn't there would understand all of it. That's the intention of a newspaper account," she said, but she felt his pride like something warm and settled. James, approaching his 2nd birthday in the fall of 1885, was firmly walking and beginning to acquire language with the rapidity of small children who have been talked to consistently, as if they understand, which Ruth did, on principle, because she believed in the respect of directness, even with people who could not yet fully respond in kind. He followed Noah around the farm on his unsteady toddler legs with an earnestness that was deeply sincere and occasionally impractical. And Noah, Ruth observed, adjusted his pace without comment, shortened his stride, paused frequently, and treated James's participation in the morning rounds as genuinely useful, which it largely was not yet but would be. By autumn of 1885, Ruth was expecting again, a fact she confirmed with Dr. Harrow, who had by this point been their physician for all 3 years of their marriage and was a capable and sensible man, and reported to Noah in the same direct manner as before. His response was, if anything, more settled this time. He smiled at her across the kitchen table. The smile was simple and complete. Their 2nd child, a daughter they named Clara, arrived in June of 1886 with considerably more patience and ceremony than James had shown, and an immediate quality of watchfulness, large dark eyes taking in everything, that Ruth recognized as a particular kind of intelligence that was going to be interesting to live with. James was fascinated by Clara with a 2.5-year-old's version of reverence, which involved frequent attempts to share his most prized possessions with her and periodic alarm when she cried, both of which Noah and Ruth navigated with the particular calm of parents who have already had a few months' experience and have therefore let go of most of the panic. The farm in the summer of 1886 was productive and full. The cistern had been built. The irrigation along the west rows had been dug in the spring, which helped considerably with the dry July they got that year. The wheat was good, a proper surplus, the kind that allowed them to pay off the last of the loan Ruth had taken for the land survey and have some portion left over. Ruth closed the ledger on that loan repayment with a satisfaction that was entirely her own. Noah's cattle herd was small by the standards of the ranching operations south of town, but well managed. He sold a portion each year at the Caldwell market, and the quality of his animals was beginning to be recognized. There were inquiries from neighboring operations about breeding stock, which Noah handled thoughtfully and which represented a growing income stream. Life had the texture of a thing built well. It was not without difficulty. The winters were hard, the work was constant. There were seasons where the weather did not cooperate and seasons where the market prices made the numbers uncomfortable. And there was the ordinary weight of raising 2 children through illness and accident and the 1,000 small crises of growing up. But it was solid. It was theirs. Ruth did not think often about the woman she had been before Kansas, before this farm, before Noah Redmond's garden. But occasionally something would remind her the particular slant of October afternoon light, or the smell of fresh-turned earth in spring, and she would stop and feel the length of the distance she had traveled, from Missouri to this Kansas farm to this life, and feel the fullness of it without grief. She had told Noah once, in the second winter of their marriage, about the 6 months of gray after her first lost love, the formlessness of that time, the way she had emerged from it not quite the same person who had gone in but someone harder and quieter and more self-contained. He had listened without trying to fix it or say it was all for the best, which she had appreciated enormously because she did not believe in all for the best as a catchphrase, but she did believe in the possibility of arriving somewhere good from somewhere hard. "You carried it a long time alone," he had said. "I did," she had said. "I was good at alone." "You still are," he had said, "but you don't have to be." She had looked at him in the firelight of their kitchen and thought that the remarkable thing about this man was not that he was without complication. He had his own complications, his quietness that sometimes became too much distance, his difficulty asking for help that had almost killed him in the June illness, his habit of worrying silently about things until she drew them out of him, but that his complications and hers fit together without requiring either of them to be different from what they were. The spring of 1887 brought another project they had discussed in the winter months, expanding the farmhouse. The house as Noah had built it was adequate for 1 person and manageable for 2, but with James at 3.5 and Clara approaching her first year, and the general reality that a farm family tended to expand its needs alongside its inhabitants, they had agreed that adding a proper second bedroom for the children and enlarging the main room was the right investment. Noah did much of the work himself over the spring and summer, with help from Thomas Haber's son Martin, who was 19 and building his carpentry skills, and from Ruth's contributions on weekends where she could hold boards, mix plaster, and bring a very specific architectural opinion about where the window in the new room should face for morning light. This last point required a debate that was conducted over 3 evenings and resolved in Ruth's favor, a resolution Noah accepted with more grace than she had expected, possibly because she was right. The expansion was finished by September and was, Noah said one evening when they were looking at the completed structure in the early autumn light, a good piece of work. Ruth agreed. The house looked now as if it had always intended to be this size, solid and unpretentious and exactly sufficient. James had insisted on helping with various aspects of the construction in the way that 3-year-olds help, which is enthusiastically and with a creative interpretation of instructions. He had his own small hammer, a real one, scaled to his size, which Noah had made for him, a fact that had made Ruth feel something inexplicable and bright, and had been known to nail various things to various other things in ways that required adjustment. But his absorption and delight in the work were so genuine that neither of them had the heart to redirect him entirely. And he did, by the end of the project, understand something real about the relationship between a hammer and a nail. Clara, who was observing all of this from her vantage point, as a newly mobile 1-year-old, appeared to be filing information for later use. Autumn 1887 settled around the farm with its usual golden weight, the cottonwoods going gold and the wheat stubble silver in the field, and the last of the garden being put to bed for winter. Ruth walked the garden one October afternoon while Noah was in the back field and James was napping, and Clara was content in her blanket on the porch, and she went along the rows in the way she always did, checking what still needed harvesting, what needed to be turned under, what she would plant differently next year. She stood for a long moment in the middle of the garden, with the October light coming warm and level from the west, and thought about the first morning she had come through Noah's fence after Clarence. She could see the exact spot where she had found the goat eating the bean plants. She could see the stakes, replaced several times over the years, and the beds reorganized and expanded according to what she and Noah had planned each winter. It was entirely her garden now as much as his. She could not have said where her knowledge of it ended and his began. Noah appeared around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her standing there. He came through the garden gate with the ease of long habit and came to stand beside her. He looked at the garden and then at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The beginning," she said. He looked at the bean plants along their poles, not the original plants, obviously, but the current generation, descendants of the same varieties he had started with in the same spot. "Clarence," he said. "Clarence," she confirmed. Clarence had, in fact, come to live at the Redmond farm not long after the wedding, because the fence at the Brenner house was being managed by the Whitfields, and Ruth was not going to ask them to accommodate a goat. He was now an elderly goat who had mellowed somewhat. He still found gaps in fencing with impressive regularity, but his garden incursions had become less ambitious as his energy declined. "If it hadn't been for that goat," Noah said, not finishing the sentence. "I had been going to say that," Ruth said. He put his arm around her shoulders and they stood in the October garden, and the light was warm and the garden was at its end-of-season fullness, and Clara made a small contented sound from her blanket on the porch, and somewhere in the house James stirred from his nap. "I was going to tell you something," Noah said. She looked up at him. "Martin Haber's been asking about the eastern parcel," he said. "The 12 acres by the creek. He's looking to start his own place now that he's got the carpentry income. I thought we might offer it to him at a fair price." This was not what she had expected him to say, but it was the kind of thing that was always layered into their conversations, the practical and the personal running together, which was the nature of a farming life. She thought about it. The eastern parcel by the creek was good land, but it was more than they strictly needed for their current operation, and Martin Haber was a solid young man who had worked hard on their expansion and deserved a fair start. "At a fair price," she said. "Yes, I think that's right. I'll talk to him next week," he said. She turned so she was facing him. "That wasn't what you came over to say," she said. She knew his rhythms. He had crossed the field to come to her, which he did not do in the middle of the afternoon unless something was on his mind. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, more quietly, "I saw you standing out here and I thought I wanted to say, before I let another day go by without saying it, that this has been the best 4 years I've had." She held that for a moment. Then she reached up and put her hand on his jaw, the way she did sometimes when she wanted him to know that she was fully present and not going to say the easy thing. "For me too," she said. "Every day of it." He covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a moment in the garden, in the October light, with the sound of Clara on the porch and James waking in the house, and the wind coming over the flat Kansas plain, with the smell of harvest and cold coming and everything still good in it. The winter of 1887 was the year they started what became a tradition: Sunday evenings with books. Ruth had her own collection of books, brought from Missouri, and Noah had his, and in the evenings when the children were settled and the fire was sufficient they read, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes in separate volumes that intersected in conversation. Ruth had strong opinions about novels. Noah had strong opinions about scientific and practical texts, but she had discovered to her genuine surprise and delight, also read more poetry than he had ever mentioned, and had opinions about that too, which she found consistently interesting even when she disagreed with them, which was often enough to make the disagreements a pleasure. James, at 4, learned his letters over that winter at the kitchen table with Ruth as his teacher. He was impatient with the slowness of letters, being a person who wanted to get to the thing faster than the process of getting there allowed. Ruth was very familiar with this feeling, which made her a better teacher for it, and by spring he could read simple words and was immeasurably pleased with himself about it. Clara watched these lessons with the watchfulness that was entirely her character, and by summer, though she was barely 2, was recognizing several letters herself, a fact she announced with a pointed decisiveness that made it clear she found James's head start only a temporary condition. The farm became a more active social center than Noah had ever intended it to be, or so he sometimes said with the air of a man who is not entirely displeased by a development he would not have chosen. Ruth had never been as solitary as he was, and she maintained friendships in town that had their own social momentum: the Calloway women, the Habers, several of the newer families who had come to the area in the settlement wave of the early 1880s. These connections had a way of manifesting as suppers and meetings and the occasional larger gathering, and Noah, who had spent 4 years in Kansas in near-total social isolation before Ruth arrived, had been absorbed into a community whether he had particularly intended to be. He was, Ruth observed, not actually unhappy about it. He was not a man who needed a great deal of social life, but he was not immune to the value of community, and he had a way with people in direct conversation that was considerably warmer than his public reserve suggested. People who knew him through his public quietness, and then had occasion to sit with him at a table, came away differently than they had arrived. Spring of 1888 brought the planting season with its usual urgency, and the farm was now running at a scale that required genuine organization. Ruth managed the planting schedule and the books and the correspondence, and Noah managed the physical operation of the farm, but the line between those roles had always been porous. She worked alongside him in the field when needed, and he came into the organizational decisions with full engagement. They were, in the assessment of the people who knew them well, a well-matched team. The Whitfields, renting the Brenner house on the eastern side of town, had by this time been there for 5 years and had made it a real home. They had children of their own, had painted the shutters, had put in a kitchen garden. Ruth drove past it periodically in town errands and felt something about the sight that was not loss exactly, but was its own thing, a recognition that a place can hold a life, and then hold another one, and that this is not diminishment but continuation. She had written to her mother's sister in Missouri that year, the only family she still corresponded with, and had described her life with a frankness she hoped conveyed the fullness of it without becoming a letter that required too much in response. Her aunt wrote back warmly and said Ruth sounded like a woman who had found her ground, which was exactly right and therefore pleased her. Noah turned 38 in the fall of 1888. She turned 32. James was 5, starting the school in town that had been established 2 years prior, a proper schoolhouse, which had been a significant community achievement, and coming home every afternoon with the day's information organized into urgent reports. Clara, 2.5, had opinions about the fact that James went to school and she did not, which she expressed comprehensively. Ruth began giving Clara slightly more structured lessons at home, partly in response to the fairness argument, and partly because Clara was going to learn one way or another, and it was better to have it organized. The schoolhouse itself was a thing Ruth had been involved in establishing, as part of the community organizing effort that had occupied much of 1886 and 1887 meetings, petitions to the county school board, fundraising, the practical arrangements of a building and a teacher. The teacher they had found was a young woman from Ohio named Miss Dorothy Frayne, 23 years old and capable, who had taken to Caldwell with a determination that suggested she intended to stay. Ruth had helped coordinate the teacher's housing arrangements and had developed a respect for Miss Frayne that was mutual and professional. "She's going to do well here," Ruth told Noah after the first month of school. "James talks about her every day." "James talks every day," Noah said. "About everything, yes," Ruth agreed. "But about Miss Frayne in particular." Noah's mouth moved. "He is 5, he said. 5-year-old admiration is the most sincere kind," Ruth said. She meant it lightly, but it was true. The school had become immediately central to the children's world in the way that schools do when they are good schools, and Miss Frayne's energy and genuine enthusiasm for teaching made it a good school. Ruth contributed what she could, including a donation of books from her own collection and occasional involvement in the school board discussions, which in Caldwell in 1888 were not free of the various tensions that came with a community of mixed origins and varying ideas about what children should learn and who had the right to decide. There was a period in the winter of 1888 going into 1889 when one of the school board members, a man named Granger who had arrived 2 years prior from Missouri and had brought with him a set of opinions that he expressed freely and loudly, attempted to restrict the school curriculum in ways that Miss Frayne and Ruth and several others found both educationally unsound and practically counterproductive. The debate ran for 3 months and was heated at points. Ruth spoke at 2 of the school board meetings, directly and clearly, with the particular economy of someone who does not waste words on rhetoric when the substance is sufficient. She was not the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the most precise, and she had Noah beside her at both meetings sitting in the back, not speaking, but present in a way that was unambiguous about where he stood. Granger backed down from the most objectionable of his proposals, though not without complaint. Ruth considered it a qualified victory and told Noah on the way home that she expected the matter would resurface in a different form eventually, because people like Granger were not changed by losing a single argument. "No," he agreed, "but they can be managed." "We'll manage him," she said. Spring of 1889 was the year the government opened the unassigned lands of Indian Territory to homesteaders. The Oklahoma land rush of April 22nd, a moment that sent thousands of settlers across the border for land claims. Caldwell, which had been a staging ground for much of the cattle trade into Indian Territory and had complicated relationships with the land politics to its south, felt the event significantly. Several families from the area joined the rush. The implications for land use, for the rights of the native peoples who had lived there and been promised those lands, for the whole political geography of the region, were enormous and contested and painful. Noah and Ruth discussed it at length over several evenings. Noah had grown up near the southern edge of the cattle country, had known men who had worked alongside and in conflict with various Indian nations throughout his ranching years, and had views that were thoughtful rather than simple. The treaty violations, the displacement, these were not abstractions to him, having seen something of their human cost. "It isn't right," he said about the rush. "The land was guaranteed. The promises were made and they are being broken, and the men breaking them are wearing government authority while they do it. And there's little enough that we, from here, can do about it," Ruth said. Not as resignation, but as an honest assessment. "Very little," he agreed. "We can say clearly what it is. We can refuse to pretend it is something prettier than it is." This seemed to her the minimum, and also, in a community where many people preferred the prettier story more than nothing. Summer 1889 was good for the farm, good weather, adequate rain, strong wheat harvest, healthy cattle. Ruth managed the season with the confidence of someone who knew the rhythms of the land now, who could read the signs in the soil, and the sky with the accumulated knowledge of several years in this specific place. She was not romantic about farming. She knew its difficulty and its unpredictability too well for romance, but she loved it with the grounded love of something chosen and worked and understood. James, at 6, was becoming a reader in the real sense, not just mechanically decoding words but genuinely absorbed in stories, which made Ruth's heart do something specific and pleased. He had finished the children's books in the house and was beginning to work his way into the main bookshelf with a selective intensity that suggested he was looking for something without quite knowing what. She started reading to him in the evenings from the books she had loved at his age, sitting in the expanded main room in the good lamplight with James on one side, and Clara pressed against her other side with the focused attention of a child who will deny sleeping, but is asleep within 10 minutes on a reliable schedule. Noah worked late in the summer evenings with the long light, and when he came in and found Ruth and the children like this on the settee, he had a habit of pausing in the doorway for a moment with a look on his face that he perhaps did not know she could see. She always saw it. It was the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not sure he would get to, and who does not take it for granted. Clara started school in the fall of 1889, 3 years old and adamant about her readiness. Miss Frayne, who had now been teaching in Caldwell for 2 years, assessed Clara's readiness at a brief introductory meeting and reported to Ruth afterward, with a slightly dazed expression, that Clara was welcome in the classroom. "She'll be 6 months ahead of the standard reading level within the year," Miss Frayne said. "I know," Ruth said. "It's rather relentless." "She reminds me of you," Miss Frayne said. Ruth looked at her. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment," Miss Frayne said. Ruth thought about this on the drive home and decided she was pleased. The fall of 1889 rolled into the winter of 1890 with the Kansas thoroughness she had come to know, deep, cold, wide-sky days of brilliant, cold sunlight, evenings by the fire. 7 years she had been in Kansas now. 5 years married to Noah Redmond. James at 6 and Clara at 3.5, and the farm solid and producing, and the farmhouse the right size for the life inside it. She was in the kitchen garden one afternoon in October 1890, putting it to bed for winter in the way she did every year, pulling up the spent plants, turning in the compost, covering the garlic she had planted for next spring, when Noah came out and stood at the garden gate watching her. She glanced up. He had a look she recognized as something he wanted to say. "What is it?" she asked, sitting back on her heels. He came through the gate and crouched in the way he always had, at the edge of the beds, so he was at her level. He picked up a handful of the dark, well-worked soil and let it run through his fingers the way he did sometimes, testing its texture. "I was thinking," he said, "that the eastern section could go to asparagus." "I've been thinking that too," she said. "It's the right kind of soil for it and we'd have it for years." "Yes," he said then, "and I was thinking that the south bed could go to a cutting garden, flowers for the house." She looked at him. Noah Redmond suggesting a cutting garden was unexpected enough to catch her attention. "You want flowers?" she asked. "I want you to have flowers," he said. "You've never put in any." "I should have suggested it sooner." She sat back completely and looked at him across the turned soil and the October light. He was 39 years old. He had silver at his temples fully now, not just a hint, and the weathering of Kansas sun and work had settled into his face in a way that she would not have changed. It was his face, the specific face of this specific life. He was looking at her with the directness that had always been him, and behind the directness the particular warmth he had never bothered to make a performance of, just lived. "Flowers," she said. "Whatever kind you want," he said. "You know gardens. You've always known gardens." She felt it, the long thread of it, from the morning Clarence had eaten his bean plants to this October afternoon in a garden that was half the one he had made and half the one she had brought to it and wholly theirs now. 8 years ago she had walked through his fence gap without an invitation and found this garden and this man and this life. "I want sunflowers," she said, "along the south fence, and peonies, and lavender along the edge." He smiled. The full version, the unguarded one she had earned over years of being the person he did not have to perform for. "Then we'll put in sunflowers and peonies and lavender," he said. She reached across the garden soil and took his hand, the one that still had a trace of dark earth on it, and held it. He turned his hand and held hers back, the same way he had held it that July morning in this same garden when he had said he wanted her to keep coming. And she thought about how that moment had been the beginning of a thing, and how a thing's beginning could be traced back and back and back until you found the true start of it, which was often not where you expected. "I'm glad you have terrible fence maintenance," she said. He looked at her. "Clarence," she clarified. The laugh that came out of him was the unreserved kind she had first heard on the night they got engaged, and it was still her favorite sound. She laughed with him, there in the October garden, and the Kansas sky was the particular blue of fall, and the cottonwoods were gold, and James was at school learning something he would come home urgent to share. And Clara was inside with Mrs. Calloway's daughter, who came to mind the children on Ruth's garden days, and the asparagus would go in on the eastern section in the spring, and the sunflowers and peonies along the south fence, and the farmhouse was solid and expanded and theirs, and the ledgers were clear. She looked at the garden around them, the garden that had started as his and become both of theirs, and which would next spring gain a row of sunflowers along the south fence, a small extravagance of color for no practical reason beyond wanting the house to have flowers, and she felt the fullness of the life she had found through a gap in a fence on a Kansas morning when she had been chasing a goat. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said most important things, plainly, without ceremony, because the plainness was the point. "I know," he said, "I love you." And then, because he was Noah Redmond and incapable of leaving a thing half-expressed when he had the words for it, more than the garden, Ruth, more than the farm, more than any of it, she squeezed his hand. "Well," she said, "that is saying something." He squeezed back. The October light fell warm and long across the turned soil and the bare garden beds, and the two of them in the middle of it all, and there was nothing left unsaid, and nothing unresolved, and nothing incomplete in the day or in the life that the day held. The winter that followed was a good one. Hard in the Kansas way, cold enough to freeze the water trough twice in January, but good in the way that winters are good when you are inside them with people you love, with enough wood and enough food and enough light. James lost his first tooth in February and presented it to Ruth with the solemnity of someone delivering a significant artifact. Clara read her first full book, a small book of animal stories, 40 pages, completed in 2 sittings with an expression of profound satisfaction at the end, and announced that she wanted more. Ruth wrote to Wichita for more children's books, and then wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City for a somewhat longer list, including items for the school that she and Noah donated jointly. And the spring came around again, as it always had and always would, full of the particular promise of thaw and new planting. The sunflowers went in along the south fence of the garden in May of 1891, a whole long row of them, their seeds pressed into the warmed soil with Ruth's own hands. By July they were tall and extravagant and absolutely themselves, turning their faces to track the sun across the enormous Kansas sky, and when she stood in the garden in the evenings with the sunflowers behind her and the light going gold and the sound of James and Clara somewhere in the yard and Noah's footsteps on the porch boards, she was entirely, irreducibly, unambiguously home. She had come west alone and uncertain. She had found a gap in a fence and a garden, and a man who watched her tend it with eyes that already held something he had not said yet. She had chosen and been chosen, and had built something with her hands and her knowledge and her full stubborn self alongside a man who was doing the same. She had planted and harvested and worried and celebrated and fought for what needed fighting, and let go of what needed letting go. She was 34 years old. Noah was 41. James was 7, and reading everything in the house and beginning to develop opinions about cattle management that he expressed without any apparent awareness that he was 7. Clara was 4 and ferociously herself, and already, Ruth suspected, going to be a woman who said exactly what she meant and meant everything she said, a trait she came by from 2 directions. The garden grew around them every year, patient and returning, holding the memory of everything that had ever grown in it. The beans Clarence had eaten, the tomatoes of that first summer, the careful rows she had tended through 12 days of a June illness, the asparagus bed on the eastern section, the sunflowers along the south fence. A garden is a kind of record, Ruth thought, standing in it on a summer evening with her hands in the soil. It holds what you have put into it and gives it back year after year, changed and renewed. Noah came out and stood at the garden gate the way he had stood on a porch 8 years ago, watching her. She looked up. "Supper," he said. "I know," she said. "One more minute." He came in through the gate and hunkered down beside her without being asked, the way he always had. He looked at what she was doing. She was tucking the last of the lavender seedlings along the border, the second planting, filling in where the first had not taken as fully as she wanted. He pressed the soil around one of the plants for her. She pressed the soil around another. They worked together in the quiet evening air, unhurried the way they did most things. "Good?" he asked, looking at the lavender. "Good," she said. She took his hand as they stood. He held it as they walked toward the house, where supper was on the stove and 2 children were conducting some sort of animated dispute about something that would require their mutual attention. The house was lit warm in the falling evening. The garden was behind them, full and settled, already planning its spring. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything had been found that needed finding. Everything that had been uncertain had, in the fullest and truest way, been answered. Ruth Redmond, who had once been Ruth Brenner, who had walked through a gap in a fence after a goat on a Kansas morning, and found the beginning of the rest of her life, walked through her own garden gate and into her own home, and the door closed behind them on the summer evening, and it was all, entirely and without reservation, enough.